If you believe power should never come before human life, then stay with me because this story proves what happens when silence finally breaks. The smell hit me before the sound, sharp and chemical like melting paint and burning plastic, and then I heard my daughter scream. It was a thin, terrified sound trapped inside the small wooden playhouse we had built together, and it cut through my chest like a blade. Smoke rolled across the backyard, and ugly gray waves and bright orange flames licked up the side of the little structure that had been pink and cheerful only minutes before. I ran barefoot across the grass, my heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my throat, and all I could think was that my child was inside, and the world had suddenly narrowed to fire and fear. She screamed my name again, coughing now, and I could hear the wood popping and cracking as the heat grew stronger. I reached the playhouse door and burned my hands, forcing it open. The heat blasted my face, and for one frozen second, I saw her curled in the corner, eyes wide, face streaked with soot and tears. I pulled her out against my chest and stumbled backward as the flames surged higher, and when I finally collapsed onto the lawn, clutching at the world, came rushing back in shout sirens and the stunned silence of neighbors who had been watching from behind fences. My daughter clung to me, shaking, her small body racked with sobs and smoke-filled breaths, and I whispered over and over, "You are safe, you are safe," even though my hands were trembling and my knees could barely hold me upright. Someone threw a blanket around us, and another neighbor finally called the fire department, but my eyes were already searching the houses around us looking for one person. Kerren stood on her porch, perfectly still, arms crossed, expression pinched with irritation rather than concern. Her hair was immaculate, her posture rigid, and when our eyes met she did not look away. She looked annoyed, as if the fire were an inconvenience rather than a near tragedy, and in that moment something inside me hardened into cold clarity. This was not an accident. Kerren had been a problem since the day we moved into the neighborhood. She was an HOA board member, or at least she liked to remind everyone that she practically ran it. She complained about chalk drawings on sidewalks, about children laughing too loudly about colors that were not on her approved palette. The Playhouse had been her latest obsession. She said it violated height regulations, aesthetic harmony, and some rule she never quite produced on paper. I had tried to be polite. I had listened while she lectured me with a smile that never reached her eyes, and I had even promised to look into it, though the structure sat fully within our yard and harmed no one. My daughter loved that playhouse. It was her castle, her spaceship, her hiding place when the world felt too big, and I refused to tear it down because someone drunk on authority demanded it. The fire trucks arrived, lights flashing, water hissing, as flames were finally beaten back. But by then the playhouse was a blackened skeleton, and the damage was done. Paramedics checked my daughter, wrapped her in an oxygen mask, and told me she would be okay, though the words trembled with a warning of how close we had come to something far worse. A police officer began asking questions, and neighbors finally found their voices, talking all at once about smoke, about seeing someone near the playhouse earlier, and about the way Kerren had been pacing the fence line that morning. Kerren herself stepped forward with a tight smile and said calmly that the playhouse was a fire hazard and that illegal structures often cause accidents like this. She said accidents as if she were discussing a spilled drink. I stared at her, disbelief mixing with rage, and said my daughter was inside, and she tilted her head slightly and replied, "That is why rules exist." In that moment, I understood exactly who she was. Not just a bully, not just a control-obsessed HOA tyrant, but someone capable of risking a child's life to prove a point. The officer's expression changed when another neighbor quietly mentioned a security camera across the street and how it might have caught something important. Kerren stiffened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it and filed it away. At the hospital later, my daughter slept exhausted, and safe, her small hand wrapped around my finger, and the beeping of monitors was the only sound in the room. I sat there replaying the flames, the scream, the way Kerren had looked at me without remorse, and the fear slowly transformed into something sharper and steadier. My phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA. A violation notice. Unauthorized structure. Safety hazard. Immediate action required. I looked at the message, then at my sleeping child, and felt a calm settle over me that surprised even myself. Kerren believed this was over. She believed she had won. She had no idea that she had just started a war she was going to lose in the most public and devastating way possible. The days after the fire moved in a strange blur of exhaustion and focus, as if my body had switched into something colder and more precise. My daughter recovered quickly on the surface, laughing again, asking when her Playhouse would come back. But every time she smelled smoke from a passing car, she flinched and pressed closer to me, and the guilt burned deeper than any flame ever could. Kerren wasted no time. Notices appeared taped to our door and mailed to our address thick envelopes, filled with official language and thinly veiled threats. She cited safety violations, aesthetic violations, and community standards, all written with smug confidence, as if nearly killing a child were simply part of enforcing order. Each letter ended the same way, with her name printed neatly at the bottom like a signature of ownership. I tried the reasonable path first. I filed a police report, gave a full statement, and provided the names of witnesses. I contacted the HOA board directly, requesting an emergency meeting and medical consideration, and I spoke calmly even when my hand shook. Kerren responded by CCNG the entire neighborhood on an email accusing me of negligence and reckless parenting and framing the fire as a natural consequence of my refusal to comply with rules. The board meeting was held in a bland room that smelled of old carpet and stale coffee, and Kerren arrived early, sitting at the head of the table, smiling like someone who already knew the ending. When I spoke about my daughter, about the fire, about the witnesses, she leaned back and folded her arms and said, "Emotions are understandable, but facts matter," and I felt the room tilt against me. She spoke smoothly about compliance and liability and how unapproved structures endanger the community, and somehow my child almost dying became a footnote in her speech. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted her, and when the meeting ended, they promised to review the matter, which I knew was another way of saying nothing would happen. Kerren left the room first, heels clicking sharply against the floor, and as she passed me, she said quietly, "You should have listened," and smiled. That was the moment I stopped trying to reason with her. I began documenting everything. Every email, every notice, every conversation. I spoke to neighbors who had been afraid to say anything before, and found that fear had turned into anger now that the line had been crossed so violently. One neighbor showed me footage from their security camera, and my breath caught when I saw Kerren in the frame earlier that day, standing too close to the Playhouse, lingering longer than necessary, her posture tense and purposeful. Another neighbor remembered hearing her complain that morning that the structure would be gone by sunset one way or another, and the words settled into place like pieces of a puzzle that had always been waiting to be assembled. Kerren did not slow down. She escalated. She fined us for debris still visible from the burned Playhouse, while my daughter was still sleeping with an oxygen mask beside her bed. She reported us for noise when relatives came to check on her. She even sent a notice suggesting child services be informed due to unsafe conditions. It was cruelty wrapped in policy, and she wielded it with pride. But the more she pushed, the more she revealed herself. Her messages grew sharper, more emotional, less careful, and in her certainty that she was untouchable, she began making mistakes. She bragged in emails about enforcing compliance at any cost. She dismissed safety concerns with chilling indifference. She assumed no one would ever challenge her version of events. At night, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing footage, transcripts, and timelines while my daughter slept nearby, and the fear that had once hollowed me out was replaced by something steadier. This was no longer about retaliation. This was about truth and accountability, and making sure she could never hurt another child behind a wall of authority. Kerren began holding informal gatherings on her porch, speaking loudly about irresponsible parents and the dangers of ignoring rules, always glancing toward our house, as if daring me to react. I did not. I watched and waited and recorded, and the silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. One afternoon, I received another email from her declaring that the matter was closed and that further resistance would result in severe consequences. I read it twice, then forwarded it to a growing folder already thick with evidence, and I smiled the first time since the fire. She believed the worst was over. She believed she had crushed opposition through pressure and intimidation. She believed she was still in control. What Kerren did not understand was that every threat, every boast, every careless word had been preserved and organized, and that the story she had tried to bury was about to be told in full, without her permission. As I tucked my daughter into bed that night, she asked softly, "Is the bad lady gone?" And I kissed her forehead and said, "Not yet," knowing with absolute certainty that the next time Kerren tried to speak, the neighborhood would finally hear the truth she had worked so hard to hide. The morning the evidence went public felt strangely calm, as if the storm had already passed, and all that remained was truth moving on its own momentum. I sat at the kitchen table while my daughter colored quietly beside me, and with one final breath, I pressed upload, releasing the footage, the emails, the timestamps, and the full unedited sequence of events into the open. At first, nothing happened, and Kerren walked the street as she always did, chin lifted, voice loud, posture proud, and then her phone began to buzz. She glanced at it, once annoyed and then again confused, and then the color drained from her face as messages stacked faster than she could read. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, phones in hand, eyes moving from screens to her house and back again, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The footage spoke clearly. Kerren near the Playhouse earlier that day. Kerren complaining it would be gone by night. Kerren sending emails boasting about enforcement at any cost. Kerren dismissing safety with words that now read as monstrous when placed beside images of smoke and a child being carried from fire. There was no editing, no narration, no manipulation. Just her own words and actions finally seen together. She tried to laugh it off at first, waving her hand and saying, "People love drama." But her voice cracked, and she retreated into her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle windows. The internet did not retreat with her. The story spread to the neighborhood, and then beyond it, shared with disbelief and fury by people who had never heard of Cedar Creek Estates but understood instantly what power without empathy looked like. By afternoon, local reporters were calling. By evening, the HOA board demanded an emergency meeting. Kerren did not attend. She sent a message claiming illness and misunderstanding, but no one responded. The same neighbors who once avoided her now compared notes, shared screenshots, and spoke openly about fear and intimidation they had carried quietly for years. The police returned with different expressions, this time firm and resolved. They asked questions again, reviewed footage again, and this time there was no hesitation, no polite distance, no benefit of doubt. Kerren emerged briefly to protest, shouting about rules and authority, until her words collapsed under the weight of evidence, and she fell silent, staring at the ground as if it had betrayed her. When they took her away, she did not look at me. She looked at the neighbors, at the cameras, at the phones, and for the first time she looked small, not powerful, not righteous, just exposed. The HOA followed quickly. Her position was revoked unanimously. Emergency reforms were announced. Apologies were issued that rang hollow but necessary. Fines were erased. Policies rewritten. The structure she had hidden behind crumbled in hours once people stopped pretending it was normal. That night, I tucked my daughter into bed, and she slept without flinching, without fear, her breathing soft and even. The next day, neighbors arrived with paint and wood and laughter, and together, they began rebuilding a playhouse brighter and stronger than the last. My daughter watched from the porch wrapped in a blanket, smiling shyly, as if reclaiming something she had almost lost forever. Kerren tried to speak online, once posting long messages about being misunderstood, about unfair treatment, about how rules exist for a reason, but no one listened. The comments were not cruel. They were final. People told her she was done. Weeks later, the case moved forward quietly and steadily, and I did not attend every hearing. I did not need to. Justice did not require my presence anymore. It moved on its own, fueled by truth and the voices of those she had silenced for too long. One afternoon, my daughter ran to the yard, laughing, ducking into her new playhouse, sunlight catching in her hair, and I felt something inside me finally loosen. Fear had taken its grip and released it. Anger had burned itself out. What remained was peace and the knowledge that cruelty thrives only in silence. Kerren wanted control. She wanted obedience. She wanted to be feared. Instead, she was known. And that was the end of her.